In this video, I'm going to talk about how we can use JUnit testing to test our JEE entity. In other words, a Java object that leverages JPA, Java Persistence API, to map a Java object onto a relational database. So we have an existing JEE entity annotated with entity annotation that maps to the micro market table in our sample database. So if we go to services, we connect to the sample database by right-clicking and selecting connect. We can see the data in our micro market table. And we've viewed the data and we've determined that a zip code is 5 digits. We've determined that area length and area width cannot be less than 0. So when we created our micro market entity that maps onto that table, we've created 3 validation constraints. For zip code, we created a pattern. And we've specified that the very first digit of the zip code has to begin with 1 through 9. And the remaining 4 digits have to be between 0 and 9. And then we have a message that would be displayed if that validation constraint is broken. And the error message's zip code must be 5 digits and cannot begin with 0. For area length, we've put the minimum value can be 0, and for area width, we put the minimum value is 0. And again, we added error messages that we want displayed if a user tries to set an area width less than 0. So now we're going to use JUnit testing to test these validation constraints and to test our entity. So we're going to right-click on our project management web application, and we're going to create new, other, and we're going to go to unit testing, and we want to test an existing class. And we can browse to select the class that we want to test, and we're going to test our micro market entity. And NetBeans creates our micro market entity test class in the test package. And we're familiar with at before class, at after class. We know at before is executed only one time before any of the tests are executed. After class is executed only one time after all the tests have been executed. At before is executed before every test, and at after is executed after every test. So before we can start working on our test class, this is a Maven project, and there's some libraries or dependencies that we have that are required for this JUnit test. So we're going to go to our POM XML file and add a couple of dependencies. So we're going to go to the bottom of our dependencies, and we're going to add a dependency hibernate. This is the group ID. This gives us the Hibernate validator. And we're going to select version 5.2.4 final. Alright, so that's that dependency. And then we're going to also add org dot extras. Okay, so those are the dependencies that we need in our project. We can do a clean and build. Oops. Let's try that again. Before I wasn't able to delete my target. Alright, so now all these tests, you can see that in the test class, it created all of these dummy tests that it assumes we want one for every set and get in our entity. I'm going to go ahead and just delete those because I want to write all of my own. So the first thing I'm going to do in my before class is I'm going to create a validator object. So I'm going to create a couple of private static attributes. So one of the things I'm going to create is just, what I want to test is the micro market entity. So I created a static micro market entity object that I can use for testing in all of my tests. I've also created this thing called validator, and you can see that it can't find the symbol. So what I need to validate my validation constraints is a validator, and it's a JavaX validation validator. So I need to import that. Now I'm going to instantiate these static objects in my before class. So before any of the tests are run, these will be instantiated. So I'm going to use a validator factory. And again, I need to import it. Now I have a validator. Now I have something that I can use that is going to allow me to test my validation constraints. Then at the same time, I'm gonna instantiate a new micro market entity. And this is only going to be executed one time before every test. So if I go back, I'm going to write a test that tests zip code. This validation constraint is tested when I call the set zip code method in my micro market entity class. So I'm going to write a test, and all tests start with the test annotation. They have to be public, void, and call it anything you want. I'm going to test the valid zip code, and you don't pass in any parameters. So now I'm going to say my micro market set zip code but that's the case. Now we're going to see if any errors were generated when we went to set that zip code. To do that, the validator, when I ask the validator to validate this zip code, it returns a set of constraint violations on the micro market entity. So basically I get a set of errors. So I have to import the constraint violation. The validator lets you validate the entire class at once, or you can specify that you want to validate just certain properties. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to validate a property, and we're going to validate the micro market object. And the property that we want to validate is zip code. And we're not going to specify any groups. So we set the zip code. Now we're going to check to see if any validation constraints were violated. And we're doing that right here. If this set errors, which is a set, if it comes back empty, that means this zip code is fine. If it comes back and there's an error, then this set won't be empty and it'll have returned a constraint violation, and that means that there was an error. So we're going to assert that the errors is empty. So we set the zip code. We check to see if there's any errors. Here we're calling to get our set of errors. If there's no errors, that means we have a good zip code. Then we can right click on this and we can do run focus test. Another thing that I find helpful is you can do Windows, IDE tools, test results, and you can see the results of every test that was executed. So just for the heck of it, let's start this with a 0 because we said that they can't start with 0. And let's run a focus test and see what happens. And we see that the assertion error, and we see that assertion error means that this didn't pass, that we asserted that it was true and this is not true, which means we got an error message. So this is our test for a valid zip code. Now let's write a test for an invalid zip code. So we can basically run the same test. So we're going to test an invalid zip code. And we're going to assert false, that it's not empty. And we're going to put in and this test passed. And we expected it to pass because we expect if I put an invalid zip code, we expect this to be false. We expect this errors to have an error message in it. So just for fun, let's print out the error messages. So we're going to print out the error messages that we get back. So for every constraint violation in this set of errors, print out the error message. We can see the error message. Zip code must be 5 digits and cannot begin with a 0. And again, if we put in a valid zip code, the test fails, which we would expect it to. All right, now let's do another test, and let's test area length. So we're going to use our micro market object, and we're going to set area length to 9.0. And then we're going to get our set of errors, and now instead of testing the property zip code, we want to test the property area length. And we're going to assert that the errors are empty because 9.0 should be a valid area length. Because we see that for area length, we said the min was 0. So we're going to test again, and we're going to make sure to accept 0. And we can see here that it doesn't want us to give an integer. So we're going to change it to a double. Now we're going to try to test a negative number. And that should be invalid. So if we try to assign area length a negative number, we should get error messages. And we do. So that just gives you a brief introduction to how you can use JUnit testing to test JEE entities, their validation constraints.